All right, so we're going to be thinking about morality and anthropology tonight. Anthropos is the Greek word in the New Testament that's translated man, not meaning the gender, but mankind, humanity. And so we're thinking about God's calling cards, those things that are beyond natural order, things that God puts in place that are astronomically improbable or can't be explained by natural order, being calling cards, trying to get our attention, drawing us to the creator, the mastermind of all creation. And so we want to think about morality. We're going to think about the human conscience tonight. So I'm going to start with some questions. First of all, what are people appealing to when they say such things such as, you shouldn't cut in line, I was here first. You must do it, you promised. I bought lunch last time, it's your turn today. Or that's not fair, something that we've all heard many times. What is being appealed to? Well, the answer is a known and acceptable standard in which people ought to behave, yet we don't do so. Another question, 70 years ago, which moral standard was higher? That of the Third Reich, that would be Hitler's regime, or that of the United States? Well, how can you compare those two? What standard would you use to compare the two? Third question, when you hear a man crying for help from a burning building, two desires within us would surface. First of all, we've learned that we shouldn't be selfish and we should help others. And so there's this desire to help others. But then there's also this instinct to preserve ourselves, natural preservation. But the latter urge is stronger than what we learn to be nice to others. So what prompts people to run into burning buildings to save others? And the answer is the conscience. It judges between learned behavior and an instinct, the learned versus self-preservation, and compels us to do what is morally right. When we're thinking about morality and the study of man, one of the books I found interesting on this was something written by Ruth Benedict, and the title of her book was Patterns of Culture, and she reviewed a number of cultures and found ethical diversity within the different cultures. But as she summarizes her research, it was interesting what she found. Moral practices of societies do differ, but the moral principles upholding those practices do not. In other words, some of the details might be different within certain societies, but the overall principles that guide those societies were found very much in common. Benedict found that some societies believed it was ethically permissible to kill one's parents after they had reached a certain age. Now, if we just stopped there, we'd say, well, that's barbaric. But the practice stemmed from a belief that people were better off in the afterlife if they entered it while still physically active and vigorous. And so the thought of killing one's parents while they're still vibrant in life was to improve their afterlife, something they believed. It wasn't right, but we can understand the underlying moral principle of caring for one's parents, and that is commendable. Although we would say murdering one's parents is not a good thing. C.S. Lewis wrote a book, The Abolition of Man, and what he shows in that book is that the moral fabric of most cultures is very similar. There's not much difference from culture to culture, though the application of that moral fabric may differ from society to society. The fact of the matter is that we do not observe radically different ethical systems in earthly societies. Can you imagine a culture in which lying, cheating, hostility, corruption, rape, murder were acceptable behaviors? In such a society where pride and greed, arrogance, selfishness were admired character bents, that would be a society that would have nothing but corruption. Such a culture would quickly collapse into ruin because trust is a fundamental component for a culture to survive. we understand the necessity of a moral fabric in a society to thrive, and that a lot of societies have similar moral fabric. A corollary of naturalism is the flat denial of absolute morality. The naturalist, someone believing in evolution, believes that moral values are not fixed in man. Absolute morality says that moral values are fixed in man, but the naturalist flatly denies that. The naturalist claims the innate tendencies of right and wrong are developed to assist man to survive, to produce, reproduce, or to socially thrive. They understand a social order is necessary to prosper. And so these are learned, the naturalists would say these are learned tendencies. They're developed in mankind in order for them to survive, reproduce, and to socially thrive. But how did these conscious needs develop from random chemical processes? Would not survival behavior dictate problem resolution of moral conflicts? In other words, the biggest guy dictates morality. It's really a contradictory thought to say that all these tendencies are just learned behavior, developed behavior to thrive, reproduce, to socially survive, but at the same time saying that there's no cause and effect for developing those. They're not naturally occurring. The moral outcome of evolution is moral relativity, something that we see very prevalent in our society today. Moral standards are flexible and fluid depending on the social dynamics. And that's one of the reasons our country is spiraling really out of control, is moral relativity. The majority is determining how we should morally behave instead of listening to the conscience that God has given us. Protagoras wrote it this way. He said, man is the measure of all things. When man is the measure of all things and God's left out of it, the worst of man is going to come out. We read that in Romans chapter 1. So let's think about some problems with moral relativity. That is, where moral norms are established by a majority decision. Well, first of all, the majority is often wrong. We see that in slavery. We see that in the South African practice of apartheid, which devalued people, enslaved people, treated them like they weren't human. And there was a time in England, the United States, where the majority thought slavery was okay. And obviously it is not. By the way, the Bible never condones slavery. It just understands the heart of man that slavery will naturally develop. And so God put limitations on it, the same thing that he did with divorce. Another reason, the majority often changes their mind. Quick reversals on ethical issues such as polygamy, slavery, women's rights, racism, human experimentation, abortion, capital punishment, the relevance of marriage and homosexuality. Just about 3 decades ago, 2.5 decades ago, we had Congress signing the Sanctity of Marriage Act. And within just another 2 decades, gay marriage was legalized, exactly contrary to what had been agreed to just 20 years earlier. We've seen a change in abortion. Wasn't legal, then it became legal federally, and now it's, with the latest ruling, it's no longer a federal provision. Capital punishment. Up until about 100 years ago, capital punishment was readily executed. A lot of people were put to death for their crimes. Very rarely now does that happen. So again, it shows the change. Homosexuality. When I was going to school, junior high and high school, homosexuality was something that was very much looked down upon. You didn't talk about it. You might get beat up if you do, and I'm not saying that's correct, but today the ideas centering around homosexuality and the acceptance of it is much more prevalent. The relevance of marriage. Actually, when you think about the battleground in our society, it's basically the foundations of what God put in place to bring a healthy society that under attack. It's Genesis chapter 1. What is life? What is the origin of life? What is gender? What is marriage? What is work? These were questions that were resolved in Genesis 1, and that's what the enemy is undermining. And so as our society stubs its nose at God's laws, at the conscience that God has put in us, which we'll see in just a moment, the worst of man comes out. And we're going to see more and more of this quick changing relativity in the matter of morality. Which generation was more ethically correct, our grandparents or ours? And I think most people would say, well, our grandparents, than the morality of the generation that we have today. But what changed? And what caused the change? Was it what's within us, deep within us, that changed? Or is it just our desire to do what we want and ignore what God has put within us as a conscience? Compelling personalities can easily sway public opinion to a minority moral view. Strong people, strong orators can cause emotional feelings in people and cause them sway their feelings. Absolute morality would be a defense mechanism to resist a tyrant from leading a society in ruin. In other words, God has put something within all the people that's going to hold back a movement that's away from the conscience. Anyone disagreeing with the moral norm would have to conform or be immoral. You see a lot of that today in the news, where our liberal media is trying to make moral people feel bad for not agreeing with immorality. But how does reform or betterment of a society occur when relativity and robotic ethics is governed by it? It can't survive. So these are some of the problems with relative morality. The materialist, and this will be the naturalist view of the conscience, equates the mind and the brain as one. You're born with a blank slate at birth. And the materialist flatly denies any moral, conscience, or any other instinctive qualities. In other words, when you're born, that's when everything starts. Everything is a learned behavior after that. But there's a problem with that. We can see from different species of creatures on the planet that they are guided by an unlearned instinctive knowledge. For example, what causes a hunting dog to point? What causes a pigeon to tumble in the air? What causes an ant to raid other ants for slaves? And what causes butterflies, like the monarch, to annually migrate thousands of miles to a specific location they've never been before? Well, the answer is instinct. They're guided by instinct. Animals make better choices in reacting to various situations and circumstances than they would be expected through chance probability. God has incorporated into them the means in which to make instinctive choices which are for their betterment. And so these animals were not born with a blank slate at birth. They were born with something incorporated into their fabric. Darwin recognized that animal instinct was a strong opposition to his theories on naturalism. He wrote a whole chapter on it in his book On the Origin of the Species. And he said to this, many instincts are so wonderful that their development will probably appear to the reader a difficulty sufficient to overthrow my whole theory. And I would say, yes, Mr. Darwin, you are right. Instinct does cause a sufficient difficulty to your theory. Observation proves that instinct defies natural law. The animals, creatures are born with instinct that wasn't learned. And it's the same way with the human conscience. We are given a moral fabric that passes down from generation to generation. When God scooped up the dirt and formed Adam, he breathed into Adam a spirit, and Adam stood up a living soul. And that conscience, that consciousness has been passed down from generation to generation. The natural ability to determine moral judgments is a characteristic that is found only in humans. So there's a difference between instinct and the human conscience. So creatures just below humanity on, quote, the evolutionary scale do not execute moral judgments beyond the basic instincts that the Creator placed there. For example, a mother caring for her young. I've seen creatures like does protecting their fawns from harm, putting themselves on the line in order to protect their young. And this is an instinct that God has put within the creatures. Dr. Jerome Kagan concludes, not even the cleverest ape could be conditioned to be angry upon seeing one animal steal food from another. Yet, that's an emotion that humans often feel when they see someone being treated poorly. They feel remorse, they feel guilt for that person, sorrow, they want to help. That's part of the human conscience. R.A. Sweater writes from the field of psychology, he writes, there are no non-human animal models for human pride, shame, and guilt. Animals don't readily exhibit these things in day-to-day behavior. The cleverest ape cannot be conditioned to be angry seeing another animal dinner being stolen by someone else. And so there's a difference between the way humans respond and other creatures respond. That's why, because we have a conscience that God has put within us that's not within the animal world. Immanuel Kant said this, two things fill the mind with ever new and increasing wonder and awe, the starry heavens above me and the moral law within me. Why do we feel bad after engaging in certain behaviors? Well, we've offended the moral consciences within us. Why do world cultures generally agree on the same code of morality? Again, it's a fallout of the human conscience that's within us. I'd like to read Romans chapter 2. Now, in Romans, Paul's putting humanity on trial, proving that we're all fallen below God's perfect standard of goodness. And so in chapter 1, he brings natural man before the tribunal. He says creation demands a creator. Instead of looking at creation and worshiping the creator, you started worshiping the creation. And so God turned you over to your own thinking, your own way, and the worst of mankind comes out. And all kinds of sins are listed in the rest of that chapter as a natural fallout. When God withdraws himself from us, the worst of man comes out. And the premise for prosecution is in Romans 1:18, where Paul says, when God reveals a righteousness, reveals truth, and man holds it in unrighteousness, then God is just in judging. And so the gavel hits the courtroom table, guilty, guilty, guilty. The next group comes in, which is the moralizer. And that's in Romans 2. The moralizer is saying he's comparing himself with someone else to show that he's superior in morality. He's judging other people. He's comparing with other people to make himself feel good. Well, Paul is trying to show him that he's not the judge. God's going to be the judge. And he's using the wrong standard. The standard that everyone will be judged to will be God's perfect standard of holiness and righteousness. And no one measures up to that. And so we read in chapter 2, Paul says this in verse 14, for when the Gentiles who do not have the law by nature do the things in the law, these, although not having the law, are a law to themselves, who show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience also bearing witness, and between them and their thoughts accusing and excusing them. So what Paul is saying is the Jews, they're the third group of people, and when Paul brings them in, he just holds up God's law. You didn't keep God's law. You thought you were special because you had the law. No, what makes you a special people is when you yield to the law as an act of worship to God. You consecrate yourself to the Lord. And so the Jews are guilty of not following the law. What Paul's argument in the first part of Romans 2 is that the Gentiles who didn't have God's written law are still living it out. Why? Because God had written it into the fabric of who they were. He'd written it into their hearts. It's something that each person gets, came from Adam all the way down, is this consciousness of right and wrong. So When we violate that software programming within us, we feel guilt. We feel impending judgment. We can't explain it. We feel bad. Paul's argument in chapter 2 of Romans is if your conscience has gone off just once and you felt guilty, you're a sinner. That proves that you've fallen short of God's perfect standard. And so Paul's confirming that we all have this moral fabric within us. It's a protection system, and the conscience is monitoring it. And when we violate that software program, the conscience is like an alarm bell. It's a clanging bell in our heads, making us feel guilty and bad. And that's God's calling card. He wants us to understand that we've fallen short of his expectations for us. Unfortunately, many try to ignore their conscience and the feelings of guilt it produces. It is the conscience deep within us, within our essence, that produces feelings of guilt when we transgress the moral law of God planted within us. James 4:17 says, "Therefore to him who knows to do good and does it not, to him is sin." About 25 years ago, I was doing door-to-door work with a group of saints down in Little Rock, Arkansas. And we were working in the poorest part of the town, boards for windows. We're knocking on doors. And I met a little girl. Her name was Brittany. She's 7 years old. And she came to the door. She'd never heard of Jesus Christ before, never heard of sin before. It was like, wow. She had no concept of God at all. And so I thought, well, I need to make sure that she understands who she is and who God is, and that she doesn't live up to God's expectations for her. So when I got to the matter of sin, I asked Brittany, I said, have you ever told a lie to your parents? And she said, nope. And I said, Brittany, have you ever disrespected your parents? Mm-mm. I asked her a couple more questions, and I said, have you ever stolen anything? And she said, nope. And then I remembered this verse, James 4:17. I said, Brittany, have you ever did something and then you felt bad after you did it? And she said, mm-hmm. I said, that's sin. That's sin. Your conscience made you feel guilty. That's what Paul says in Romans 2. If that happens even once, that means that you're a sinner before God. And so I told her about sin, but then I told her the solution in Jesus Christ. Gave her a nice print, a gospel print. She took 3 of them. She wanted one for her friend and one for her grandmother. And she was so happy to hear about a God that loves her, even despite her failings, and sent his son to die for her. So James 4:17 is a great verse for affirming the moral conscience within us in Scripture. Natural man cannot identify the source of these intense feelings of guilt. Man rationalizes, if doing something I know to be wrong induces mental fatigue, causes guilt, then doing what I know to be right should ease my guilty pangs. Well, the evolutionists can't explain the will, can't explain learning, can't explain memory, denies that there's a conscience. So this is hard for the naturalists to explain. Except for Christianity, the world's religions have a need of doing. They're a doing religion to obtain supernatural blessing. So let's just think about world religions for a minute. If I'm a person, no matter where I'm living, and I do something wrong and I feel guilty, if I do what I think is good, that kind of soothes my conscience. It makes me feel better. There's still the guilt there, but it's my attempt to make myself feel better. And that's why world religions clear around the globe all are a doing religion. Whether it's Islam keeping the 5 pillars, whether it's Mormonism giving your tithe, getting married in a Mormon temple so you can get to the third heaven, Or Wicca, you're increasing your spirituality by being in tune with nature, and on and on and on. Whether it's Hinduism, I mentioned this earlier about increasing your karma from life to life through reincarnation. You finally get up to be part of the impersonal all. Or works-based religion, where you're doing a checkbook Christianity. You're doing this and this to impress God, try to make him love you more than he already does, which doesn't work. It's all doing. It's works-based religion. It's a natural fallout, a natural product of a depraved, guilty human conscience. Now that stands in contrast with biblical Christianity. The fact we feel guilt is evidence to us that we did not continue well doing. We did not obey what we instinctively knew appropriate behavior. Thus, we proved ourselves that we are sinners and that we need a Savior. Only biblical Christianity is a done religion. It says God has done everything necessary to save you. You just have to trust in him. And grace plus a nickel is not grace. Anything that we're trying to add to the work of Christ is offensive to God. And so the guilty conscience is God's calling card to draw him to the truth and to himself through Christ. The world's religions are trying to ease their guilty conscience by doing. But again, the naturalist, the materialist can't explain the conscience. It can't explain instinct. In the same way God put instinct into certain species of animals and birds and so forth, he put a human conscience within the human being. Again, these things are somehow mysteriously passed down from generation to generation. And so man isn't a blank slate at birth, as a naturalist teaches. It doesn't make sense. That concludes our discussion tonight. We'll just end there and then just open it up for questions.